Ever catch yourself staring at those massive ships, like those huge cargo
Oh,
ships?
yeah.
It's mind-blowing, right? How do they even build something that massive? That's what we're diving into today. The role of a vessel assembly supervisor.
It's a pretty incredible job when you think about it.
Yeah, they're the ones who make sure all the pieces of this gigantic puzzle come together perfectly.
Exactly. Like, imagine being the conductor of a giant orchestra, but instead of music, you're orchestrating the construction of a massive ship.
And to help us understand what it takes to land this kind of job, I've got expert speaker with us today.
Glad to be here. It's a field that most people don't know much about.
So let's clear things up a bit. Expert speaker, could you give us a quick rundown of what a vessel assembly supervisor actually does on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. The guide we've got here mentions coordinating, managing. Sounds like a pretty intense juggling act to me.
It does sound like they've got a lot on their plate, keeping everything running smoothly.
Oh, absolutely. And the stakes are high. I think the biggest misconception people have is that it's all, just shouting orders and like overseeing a bunch of manual labor.
Right.
And while, yeah, hands-on leadership is super important, there's a whole lot more strategy involved than people realize.
So it's not just about being a tough boss.
No, not at all. You've got to be able to analyze data, troubleshoot technical problems, figure out how to make things more efficient, all while juggling budgets and deadlines.
Wow, that's a lot to handle. Okay, so let's say I'm prepping for an interview for one of these vessel assembly supervisor roles. First question. What inspired you to pursue a career in vessel assembly? What if my background isn't exactly, ship shape, more like rowboat than cargo ship?
Right, right. I think the key there is to focus on what we were just talking about. Like, even if you haven't built a ship before, you've probably got skills that translate.
So highlight the transferable skills.
Exactly. Maybe you've managed teams in a fast-paced, high-pressure environment, even if it wasn't shipbuilding. Have you had to be good at solving problems on the fly? Are you great at logistics, at making sure complex processes run smoothly?
Makes sense.
Draw those connections for the interviewers, show them how your experience fits.
Show them the blueprint of your career path, so to speak. Okay, now the guide mentions that safety is a huge deal in vessel assembly. Makes sense. It's not exactly a risk-free environment.
Absolutely. One wrong move could have, some really serious consequences.
Right.
So when they ask that question about safety protocols, like how do you ensure all safety protocols are followed, you've got to demonstrate that you're proactive, meticulous about safety.
It's not enough to just know the rules, right? You have to live and breathe them.
Yeah. It's about building a culture where everybody's on the same page about safety.
Do you have any, stories that really highlight how critical that safety culture is? Something from your own experience, maybe?
Well, I remember one time I was working with this team, and we were under a lot of pressure to meet a deadline. Everybody was feeling the heat.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And they started taking shortcuts. They were so focused on getting the job done that they started neglecting some important safety protocols, like lockout, tagout procedures.
Oh, right, to de-energize machinery during maintenance.
Yeah, exactly. And thankfully, nothing major happened. There was a near miss, and that was a huge wake-up call for everybody. We realized that just having the rules in place isn't enough, We had to talk about it more, have regular safety huddles, and make sure everyone understood why each rule was important, not just what the rule was.
It's about making those safety protocols second nature, embedding them into the team's DNA.
Exactly. And speaking of teams, another question you'll probably get is, how do you manage a team of vessel assemblers to ensure timely completion of projects? They're trying to see your leadership skills.
Right. And it makes me think about the functions and core abilities section from the guide, coordination, time management, social perceptiveness.
Oh, for sure. Those are all key. And don't underestimate managing personnel resources.
What do you mean by that?
It's more than just managing tasks. It's about managing people. Each person has different strengths, weaknesses, and ways of working. You've got to know your team inside and out.
So it's about knowing your team just as well as you know the blueprints.
Exactly.
And the guide mentions that these projects often come with, really tight deadlines, lots of pressure. How does a good supervisor keep their team motivated and productive in that kind of environment?
That's where understanding both the pros and the cons of this kind of work is super valuable. You've got to acknowledge the challenges. Don't shy away from that.
Okay.
Maybe share a story about a time you faced a seemingly impossible deadline, but then, flip it. Talk about the feeling of accomplishment after you achieve something that complex. the teamwork, the fact that you're working with innovative technology.
Turn that pressure into a positive.
Yeah,
I like it.
right.
Speaking of high standards, one of the questions they ask is, how do you ensure that quality standards are met during vessel assembly? And one thing that struck me in the career stages section is that quality is presented as everyone's responsibility, not just the supervisors.
Oh, for sure. You're absolutely right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Even those entry-level technicians, they all play a part in quality control.
Right from the start.
Yeah. So it's less about like a top-down enforcement thing and more about fostering that culture of quality from day one.
Got it.
Regular training is important, clear expectations. But I think the biggest thing is taking the time to explain the why. Why is this standard in place? How does it impact the final product?
That makes sense.
And then recognizing and celebrating people who go above and beyond, that makes a big difference.
Catching those small wins.
Exactly.
Okay. Now let's talk about conflict. Because let's face it, shipbuilding, it seems like it attracts a certain personality type, right?
You're not wrong. It takes a certain kind of person to thrive in this field.
So how do you handle those inevitable conflicts or disagreements that pop up, especially with those big personalities working under pressure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right, conflict is bound to happen, especially when you've got a mix of people who are like super detail-oriented, working alongside those who are all about speed.
Right. Two different approaches.
That's where active listening becomes super important. You've got to really hear each person's perspective, try to find some common ground, and then guide them towards a solution that works for everybody.
So it's more about being a mediator than a dictator.
Exactly. It's all about that human element, being able to understand and navigate all those different perspectives. Because at the end of the day, that can make or break a project.
Totally. Now, speaking of navigating, how would you answer this question? How do you stay up to date with industry developments and trends in vessel assembly? Because this is a field that's constantly evolving, right?
It really is. A curious mind is so important in any job, but especially in this one.
The guide mentions things like industry conferences and professional organizations. But one thing that I found super interesting was the emphasis on online resources, like industry publications, social media groups.
Oh yeah, there's a gold mine of information out there.
It's incredible. What are your thoughts?
It's not just about those formal qualifications anymore. It's about that continuous learning, always seeking out new information. And the great thing is we've got access to so much of it right at our fingertips.
Right. So how can a good leader, like a vessel assembly supervisor, how can they inspire that same drive in their team? Because it's easy to feel overwhelmed, right, by this need to constantly adapt and learn new things.
I think you have to use those changes to your advantage. Instead of letting people get bogged down by that fear of falling behind, encourage a growth mindset.
I like that.
Celebrate the team members who actively seek professional development. You know, when there are cool new advancements in the field, highlight those. Present it as an opportunity.
Instead of a threat.
Yes, it's a chance to be on the cutting edge of this industry.
Love that. Okay. Let's talk about those technological advances for a second, because that section of the guide really stood out to me.
It's amazing, isn't it, how much technology has changed things?
It's not just about traditional shipbuilding anymore, is it?
No, not at all. We're talking robotics, AI, all of that is transforming the industry.
So how would you answer this question? How do you ensure that your team members have the necessary skills and knowledge to perform their jobs effectively, especially with all this new tech coming in?
I think the key is to acknowledge that the skills gap is changing. It's constantly evolving. Yes, those core mechanical skills will always be essential, but you've got to be adaptable. You've got to be willing to embrace new technologies. And as a leader, that might mean investing in training programs that don't just focus on the what, but also the why behind all this new technology.
You're not just teaching them how to use the tools, but also why those tools are so important in the first place.
Exactly. Okay, now I know one question that probably keeps every aspiring vessel assembly supervisor up at night is this whole budget and deadline thing.
Oh, for sure.
Because, yeah, those projects are huge.
How do you ensure that vessel assembly projects are completed within budget and on time? I mean, it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it's a totally valid concern. But honestly, that's where having those strong project management skills is absolutely essential. And it's not about just like working hard.
Right.
It's about working strategically. So when you get that question about deadlines and budgets, don't just give them a generic answer like, oh, I'm organized. No, give them concrete examples.
Okay, so like what kind of examples?
Well, maybe talk about a time you used project management software to keep track of everything. or how you delegated tasks effectively so that everybody was working on the right things at the right time,
Right.
or even a time when you identified some kind of cost-saving measure that helped keep the project on track.
So it's all about those quantifiable results.
Exactly. Show them, don't just tell them.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the interview process, but let's step back for a second, look at the bigger picture. What's one thing our listeners could do, like right now, to start boosting their careers in this field?
The career insight section in this guide is actually full of great advice, but if I had to pick just one thing, start building a portfolio.
A portfolio
Yeah.
for Vessel Assembly Supervisor. That's interesting. And you don't need to wait until you have some fancy title to get started, right?
Exactly. Think back to projects you've worked on, even if they were smaller scale. Did you find a way to streamline a process? Did you solve a really complex technical challenge?
Okay.
Did you successfully lead your team through a really difficult project? Document it.
How do you document something like that?
Take pictures. Include any relevant data. Gather testimonials from colleagues who can vouch for your skills. You want something tangible that you can point to prove your abilities.
So it's like building a case for yourself.
Yeah.
Showing those problem-solving skills in action.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of tools that can help people stand out, let's talk about RoleCatcher's AI for a minute.
Oh, it's a game changer for sure.
It's like having a personal interview coach in your back pocket.
Right. And it's always there, ready to help you refine your answers and tailor them to specific job descriptions.
Okay, but for someone who's never used it before, how does it actually work? Let's say I'm getting ready for this Vessel Assembly Supervisor interview, and I'm using RoleCatcher. Walk me through it.
It's surprisingly simple. You basically input your answers to common interview questions, the kinds of questions we've been talking about today, and RoleCatcher's AI gets to work. It analyzes your answers not just for, grammar and clarity, but it goes deeper than that. It looks at how well your answers actually align with what that specific hiring manager is looking for based on their job description.
Wow. So it's not just a fancy spell check. It's actually assessing the content and relevance of what I'm saying.
Exactly. It's all about making sure that your unique skills and experiences shine through in a way that's going to resonate with the people who are actually making the hiring decisions.
So it's like having a secret weapon in your job search arsenal.
Pretty much.
Well, there you have it, folks. Everything you need to know to ace that Vessel Assembly Supervisor interview. A huge thank you to expert speaker for joining us today and sharing such valuable insights.
My pleasure. Good luck out there, everyone. Remember, those ships aren't going to build themselves.
And for all our listeners, don't forget to check out RoleCatcher. It could be the game changer you've been looking for. Until next time, keep those career aspirations sailing high.